Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. So, Tim, this summer hasn't been so quiet at the Capitol. The latest brouhaha has been this SB 14, a bill that would put tougher penalties on sex trafficking, raising it to the level of serious crime. Now, I'm still sort of shocked that this is not already in the category of a serious crime, Tim. And I think so would most people. But you would think that something like this would just sail through with bipartisan support. But no, that didn't happen. So how about filling us in on the ugly details?
Certainly not in your California Assembly did it sail through with bipartisan support until public outrage took over. So the bill SB 14 by Senator Shannon Grove would make certain sex trafficking crimes to be a serious felony. And, one of the issues that both the Senate and Assembly Public Safety Committees, and they have been nicknamed over the years the Public Endangerment Committees, because they are more concerned about, agenda stopping three strikes and stopping tough on crime public safety laws and pursuing racial justice rather than taking an honest look at what needs to be done to protect public safety and ensure that heinous crimes like sex trafficking are properly punished. And so that's exactly what happened here. Even though the bill SB 14 passed the Senate by a 40-0 vote, so even the most far left senators on criminal justice issues voted for the bill in the Senate, the bill ran into a wall in the Assembly Public Safety Committee, which is dominated by far left ideologues. And so the chairman, Reggie Jones-Sawyer from South Central Los Angeles, basically made the point that this would enhance a crime that could become a third strike, and we cannot do that. So the committee voted down the bill. Well, then the next day, all hell broke loose. And it started when Governor Newsom was asked about the issue. And he said, gee, I was surprised. I've been fighting sex trafficking and human trafficking since my earliest days of my political career in San Francisco. And I've reached out to the author of the bill, and we're going to do something about it. Then later in the day, the new Assembly Speaker, Robert Rivas, gave a speech to the Sacramento Press Club, which I attended. And he was asked multiple times by different reporters about the bill. And you could tell this was becoming a media firestorm. And the reporters, you could see the look in their eyes. They saw a great story here. And they asked him, what do you think of this? What are you going to do about it? And he said, I was surprised by that too. I've reached out to the senator on that bill and we're going to connect on this, but I'm working on getting a resolution here. Well, later in the day, Assemblyman Jones-Sawyer and Senator Grove had a meeting where they talked about the issue, and Senator Grove made clear, I'm not going to amend the bill to deal with the three strikes issue, take it as it is. And, there was kind of some word salad put out by Mr. Jones-Sawyer, and even there was a 14-thread tweet explaining the issues surrounding the bill put out by Assembly Democrats. And remember the adage, when you're explaining, you're losing. And that kind of word salad and all of that detail, the Assembly Republicans quite effectively boiled it down. You're either on the side of victims or you're on the side of the traffickers. And so that firestorm really took hold. And so on the last day, the Assembly was in session before the summer recess this past Thursday. They held a hearing after adjournment of session, and they did a quick about face. And the committee voted it out on a 6-0 vote. And the chairman made very clear this is not going to be debatable. They just wanted to vote the bill out and move forward. So now the bill is seemingly on track to be passed. But already you saw several Assembly Democrats publicly come out and say, I'm for the bill. I'm committed to doing anything to have it passed. Even one of the members of the committee who voted against it on Tuesday, she came out and said, I'm committed to doing whatever I can do to help the bill pass. I made a mistake. So it really is, I would say, more of a communications lesson than anything else. It really is true when you're explaining you're losing, but also that it's a real test for the new speaker. No committee has gotten the Democrats into more trouble this year than the Public Safety Committee on the fentanyl bills before them, and now on this human trafficking committee. And if Mr. Mr. Rivas, who said, I'm not going to make big changes in the committee chairmanships during my first months in office, it's pretty clear he probably does need to make a change in the chairmanship and the makeup of the Public Safety Committee. Because at the very least, if you are the speaker, you need to have people who are your loyalists on these key committees. And when a speaker realizes this is a disaster for our party, we need to change course, you need loyalists on the committee who are going to back you up, or maybe didn't get you into this mess in the first place. So we will see what happens after the legislature comes back from recess. It seems clear that the bill is on track to pass, but you never know. Democrats were still going on after the vote, talking about the three strikes issue and all of these sorts of challenges. I think it's clear that those Democrats haven't learned their lesson on this bill. And this is the kind of issue where it galvanizes public opinion and it gets people focused on how Sacramento is out of touch. And this is the kind of thing where people could lose their seats over a vote, a bad vote on this issue. So we'll see. Stay tuned after the summer recess, but it was definitely not a quiet end of the week onto vacation for the legislature.
Well, Tim, it seems just crazy to me that you would have to be defending your side on this issue. And the excuses that I've read about were everything from, well, we're not doing anything. The bill does nothing for the survivors of sex trafficking, or well, we'd have to put more people in jail. I mean, the excuses went on and on and on, and they were all kind of goofy. And I think for the general audience, for Californians, they would just think that they were absolutely untethered with these ridiculous excuses. So yes, they were on the wrong side, and hopefully they will fix this and get this right.
Well, and it doesn't matter if a bill is window dressing or does not much of anything. A lot of bills do that. You're taking a public stand as the legislature against human trafficking. Shouldn't be a hard vote.
Well, here in Southern California, it's becoming the summer of discontent. So, I think actually this year was the year of the strike. So we had the teacher strike, we had the hotel workers strike, now we have the Hollywood writers strike, and then they were just joined by the actors. So, this is a big deal here because the work stoppage has a domino effect. The stage workers aren't working, the costume designers aren't working, the caterers aren't working. This could cost us billions of dollars. And I think what's happened is that the COVID money, people are spending that down. A lot of the workers are facing high inflation, high cost of living here. And there's especially for the screen actors and the writers, there's this looming issue of being replaced by, of all things, artificial intelligence.
It's very interesting. We've talked about these issues in the past with our Bartlett Cleveland, and disruption by technology is a normal thing in our history, and disruption is, not to be feared. Yes, there may be some challenges you have to adjust to, but it's very interesting that the very industry that's pioneering video games and other things are wanting to grind things to a halt over technology. Yeah, it's a real pickle because you have the studios aren't making a lot of money these days. They're losing money. Streaming companies are losing money. Writers and actors, as always is the case, they want to be paid more and have better benefits and all of these sorts of things. Thankfully, I'm not the mediator in this case, so I don't know what is the split the difference face-saving moment to cut a deal, but it seems like both sides are dug in for a long road ahead. Perhaps, Ro, it's our opportunity to be scabs and offer ourselves as actors and singers and dancers for various productions that need to go on.
That's right. I always wanted to be an actress, but my father said, I don't know if you can make a living doing that, dear. And of course, I wouldn't be able to, but Dad knows best, of course. Well, guys, this is an opportunity to open that book. You don't need to turn on the TV. You can read all kinds of wonderful books out there for the summer.
And you can go to our YouTube page, which is youtube.com/Pacific Research 1, the number 1. And you can see all the great videos that we put out on a regular basis, short little videos highlighting our books and studies, and longer pieces from our past events. So there's plenty of content there if you run out of things to watch.
And if you'd like to get out and about, we've got a new luncheon next month for our Southern California supporters. We wanted to let you know that we've got another terrific guest, John Yu. John is a law professor at UC Berkeley, and and many know him as a Fox News contributor when it comes to Supreme Court and other legal matters. And going back further, he was the Bush administration official at the Justice Department who wrote those so-called torture memos when he was a Deputy Assistant Attorney General. These days, he's authored a new book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Supreme Court, and it's part of the Regnery Publishing's Politically Incorrect Guide. We call it the Pig series when I was an editor back in the day. He will be speaking at our luncheon at the Pacific Club on August 15th, and he's a really terrific speaker, and we're lucky to have him.
And another great event, and you can register for all of these events at pacificresearch.org/events. We are having an upcoming webinar with our Dr. Wayne Winegarden and Carol Roth, who's a recovering Wall Street analyst and TV host and author, and she's the author of the new book, You Will Own Nothing. They're going to have an interesting discussion on ESG and all of these sorts of issues of government pushing themselves into the economy and into our personal investing and decision making. And note, we have a new date. The date has been pushed back. It's now August 2nd at 11 a.m. Pacific time. So you can register for both events at pacificresearch.org/event. So this week on the podcast, we have our Kerry Jackson, and he is the co-author of a new study with our Dr. Wayne Winegarden called Enriching Lawyers, Not Helping Victims. And it talks about the mess of our tort system in the country and the problems that all of these crazy laws empowering attorneys have gotten us. And it cites that we pay a tort tax of about $1,300 a person thanks to lawsuit abuse. And so it makes the case, they crunch the numbers, and they determine that if we pass the types of reforms that are needed to reform the legal system, we could grow the economy by about 2% over time. So it's a really interesting study, and Kerry will talk about some of the examples of lawsuit abuse that they highlight in the study and some of these crunching the number findings. And then they talk about reforms to fix the system to make sure that we're actually helping victims while ensuring that lawyers aren't profiting off the suffering of others. So I think you'll enjoy the discussion today.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. And here's Kerry Jackson. Kerry, we're so happy to have you as a guest this week to talk about your new study, Enriching Lawyers, Not Helping Victims, which you've co-authored with our Dr. Wayne Winegarden. So this study documents the problems with America's legal system and the potential for enacting reforms. So let's start by painting the picture. You note in the study that Americans effectively pay a tort tax. So how much do we pay for lawsuit abuse? And just how much does lawsuit abuse negatively impact our economy?
There are some rather startling numbers when you start digging into this. And there are a couple of groups we looked at that put these numbers together that we used for our report. And one was a 2021 study by the Perryman Group. And they found that frivolous lawsuits cost almost $285 billion a year in direct costs. There's another $429 billion lost in output. And they also estimate about 4.24 million jobs are lost, too, due to frivolous lawsuits. There's also a loss of $70.3 billion in annual federal revenue. At the state level, there's a loss of about $21 billion, and local governments are also losing about $18.6 billion a year. And the study overall found that frivolous lawsuits impose what they call a tort tax of a little over $1,300 per person across the country. And then there was another, we found some numbers, U.S. Chamber of Commerce Institute of Legal Reform found that tort costs add up to about $443 billion a year, which is 2.1% of the U.S. GDP. And when you break that down, that's $229 billion in general and commercial liabilities, almost $200 billion in automobile accident claims, and $17 billion in medical liability claims. The numbers have grown too. The direct economic costs, according to the Chamber, have grown yearly 6% from 2016 to 2020. That's a pace of growth faster than inflation, which has been pretty steep in recent years, also faster than GDP growth. So there's some numbers there that on one hand they are startling to look at. At the same time, nobody should really be surprised if they start poking around into this world of frivolous lawsuits.
As your new study points out, lawsuit abuse is not only hindering the economy, but it also affects state and federal budgets and household affordability. So what did you and Wayne find out about how the tort tax takes away badly needed tax revenue and increases the cost of living for us all?
Lawmakers are foregoing a substantial amount of revenues because they are not enacting tort reforms as they should. So this money gets eaten up, money that that would boost the economy, and boosting in a growing economy is going to create higher tax revenues, and so they're missing out on that. You look at the family, and I mentioned that $1,300 tort tax per person. That $1,300 that can hurt. People that hurt the most are at the bottom. The people who have less money to start with or lower socioeconomic status. Even struggling middle class families are going to get hurt by this. Let's say you're living in a tight budget in a state where the cost of living, or a city where the cost of living is extremely high and very painful. California, for one. And you budgeted and you can get by every year, but then $1,300 can make a difference. That's a couple of car payments. It's a lot of food, and it hurts family business too. It has an overall economic drag. So our economy doesn't sputter, but it doesn't work as efficiently as it should when you have those lawsuits dragging it down.
Kerry, your study illustrates several examples of lawsuit abuse, primarily in the hands of litigators who file junk lawsuits, seemingly to try to bring relief for those who are harmed, but to line their own pockets. Share with our listeners a few of these examples that clearly demonstrate the need for reform.
Well, I think one place that people could identify with, because they've heard of the law, the Americans with Disability Act, and this is used to stack up frivolous lawsuits, and they're not for the public good. They're the line of pockets of the trial lawyers who are behind these things, and it's really a shakedown. There's one plaintiff, and you have serial plaintiffs who are essentially working on behalf of these law firms. There was this one, a 70-year-old man. He filed 180 lawsuits in California. Out of this, the lawyers get handsome fees. The clients get a meager amount for being proxy plaintiffs on behalf of the law firms. These have been called drive-by lawsuits because neither the lawyers nor the plaintiffs will actually enter the property or go into a store or go into a business that they're suing for violations of the Americans with Disability Act. And some of the things that are extremely minor that we found, a sign was slightly askew. So they're going to sue over that. Parking space is a few inches, not quite as wide as it should be. So they will take these technicalities and turn them into a shakedown, and it gets pretty serious. The prosecutors in LA, San Francisco counties actually went after the San Diego law firm who was doing this. Now, they ended up not winning. The suit was dropped in court, but this tells you a lot when you have district attorneys essentially saying you can't do that. You are going too far with this stuff with your ADA lawsuits. And it's also been called jackpot justice, and that's probably a phrase I'll probably use again before we're done today. But this is essentially what they're looking for. They're not trying to make things better for the public. They're not trying to create a public good, but they're trying to, and they're doing it. They're lining their pockets.
So one of the examples you highlight in the study involves California's Prop 65, which is supposed to help Californians who are harmed by toxics, but actually has served to enrich lawyers. So walk us through how it works. How do lawyers abuse laws that have very good intentions, but really they use the laws to make money for themselves while doing very little to help the actual victims?
And under Prop 65, businesses are required to post warnings about significant exposures to chemicals that cause cancer, birth defects, and other reproductive harm. But eventually, as they are very industrious with this sort of thing, lawyers say, well, we can use this to make ourselves rich. In one case, there was a lawsuit against 90 companies. They were accused of having acrylamide. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correct if there are any chemists out there. It's a word I think many of us have read. We don't necessarily use it in our daily conversation, but they were accused of having this chemical in their coffee. Now, it's a natural occurring chemical, and there's no indication that we found that the exposure to it in food is a cancer risk. Eventually, this suit was tossed, but 65 is still being used to shake down, to squeeze businesses by unscrupulous lawyers who want to profit. And they don't have public health in mind. Prop 65 was supposed to be promoting public health, and that's not what they have in mind. They want to go in there and find any way they can to put the pressure, find a settlement. And generally, my understanding is they would rather settle out of court without having to go to trial on this because it's easier for everybody. The business can say, I want to get you out of my hair. I'll settle for whatever you're saying. If we go to court, it's going to cost more. And the trial lawyers say, yeah, that's fine too. We'll take that because the trial prep for them, time is also going to be costly. So from 2015 to 2019 in California, based on Prop 65 settlements, there was $142 million in penalties and attorneys' fees. Now, that's two different things there. Of that $142 million, or close to $109 million of it actually went to lawyers or the law firms, and with only the remainder going to penalties. So, again, I'll use that term again of jackpot justice, and that's what they're looking for, and that's what they're finding.
Another type of abuse that most people may not be aware of, and certainly I wasn't, is that state attorney generals are hiring private litigators on a contingency basis to pursue litigation or costly settlements against various types of industries who are allegedly doing harm. So explain how this works and why this practice is subject to so much abuse.
I would say your typical attorney's general office is quite often not big enough to handle some of these cases, some of these suits that they go through. And the tobacco lawsuit would have been one of those going back to the 90s, the tobacco settlement. And often the attorneys who are working may not have the expertise that some outside litigators or the experience would have in these lawsuits. So they go outside and the attorneys general hire private litigators. And a recent example of this is the opioid lawsuits that are out there. And there's nothing wrong with contracting lawyers who can do the work necessarily there, but it's the setup that they have that is hurting. And they have they get a share of the settlements of what, if they're settled out of court or if they go through the trial phase. And their incentive is to squeeze as much money as possible out of the companies that are being sued. This goes beyond what you would really consider reasonable settlements, reasonable amount of money, penalties for the companies. And the way around this is to have a fixed fee arrangement where this law firm can do the job. They know what they're doing. They've had experience, expertise in this field. But here's what we're going to pay you, and we're not going to pay you based on how much you win. So we just expect you to do a proper job and not get in here just to enrich yourselves through our lawsuit.
So certainly elected officials in Sacramento and Washington must see every day how bad the problem lawsuit abuse is, yet they seem to do nothing about it. Based on your research, what are some of the reasons why elected officials are seemingly burying their heads in the sand when it comes to a real problem affecting not only the economy, but their constituents' well-being?
I think it's like so many other political problems that aren't solved by lawmakers, that they can resolve, but they don't. You have enough policymakers and lawmakers around the country in very prominent positions who have been co-opted. In some cases, you could even say owned by special interests. I mean, we know this on various different issues. It's just not legal reform. So their incentive is not to reform, not to change things, because they have, they're essentially invested in the system as is. And, I've been keeping up with public policy now for about 30 years, and this is across the board. I'm sure it's been going on longer than that. I don't want to say this is something new, but there's a lot of money at stake, and that essentially is the bottom line. So it's difficult to make changes. They're having some improvements, and we've been hearing about tort reform, and we certainly, one of my recollections is the Contract for America there's some tort reform there at the federal level that was supposed to be ease things out there. So there have been some gains made, but at the same time, there are places where ground has been lost and other places where things are just like what they were 30 years ago.
Well, now that we've outlined the many abuses in the system, let's look at reforms. So what are some of the positive changes you and Wayne recommend in your study that, if enacted, would curb the ability for the legal system to be a financial jackpot for attorneys from meritless claims?
Well, go back to what I was saying before, the limit attorneys generals and outsourcing their official duties to private litigators. Put some limits on that. Don't let them go out there, hire them just so they can go shake down companies. The contingency fees, start going for the fixed fee arrangements where they will pay a certain amount to get the job for the contract work. Yeah, and you can do basic tort reform ideas like capping contingency fees. You can also, in these cases, find a way to punish lawyers for following and taking these frivolous lawsuits and hurting people's lives, which is what they end up doing. As of now, there's really they can go out there and do whatever they want to do, and there are no negative consequences to their actions.
So finally, we're nearing the end of the legislative session at the state capitol in Sacramento, and in Congress is halfway through the year in Washington. So what reform proposals are being considered at the state and federal levels this year that you think would make a difference in addressing the problems outlined in your study? And how do you rate their chances of passage? Are we more likely to take a step in the right direction this year or take a step backward?
Well, I'm going to quote Dan Walters briefly because I guess we'd have to call him the dean of California political columnists because he's been doing this, 60 years or more? He's been at it, and his observations are right on, and he knows of what he speaks, but he had a column in Cal Matters. Nothing is more pervasive in California's capital than what have been dubbed tort wars, skirmishes over rules governing personal injury lawsuits. No session of the legislature is complete without at least one clash over who can sue whom for what act and collect damages that can potentially reach hundreds of millions of dollars. The one thing to me that's sticking out more than anything else is the Private Attorney General's Act. It's also called the Sue Your Boss Law. And this really hurts businesses, particularly family business. It allows private lawsuits to be filed to enforce California labor laws. And businesses have been bucking against this, as you would expect, because they are losing money on it. They're losing time, the resources being poured into trying to defend themselves for what are often unnecessary and frivolous lawsuits. So there's a ballot measure that's we're going to be able to vote on that in 2024. It's qualified, so that could go a long way to changing some things. But there's still, in California, a pretty deep hole to come out of. The American Tort Reform Association ranks California third right now with the worst legal system in the country. It had been first for a few years, but it had some, and it wasn't improvements that made it that have it coming in now at number 3. It's actually 2 other states have gotten worse. So and these are rankings. This is kind of a funny way to put it, but the American Tort Reform Association called these judicial hellholes report. At the federal level, I'm not aware of anything that's terribly significant in D.C. I think the action right now, if we look at it, is mostly going to be in the states. Florida has been pushing and has had some successes in tort reform this year, this particular session. I believe trying to rein in the trial bar. And I think you might see, don't be surprised, you see other red states following as we are resorting our populations and our politics in this country, which is another issue altogether, which at times is frustrating to me. I don't like seeing this. I mean, we hear about diversity. Well, we're becoming less diverse politically as we move around to live in places where we enjoy the politics in that particular place. And as I say, I think you're going to see other red states follow this. And Georgia particularly is one that could use reform. It replaced California as number 1 in judicial hellholes. It is my home state, so I can be critical of it, I suppose. So yeah, there's work to be done there. I think people in office, both in the legislature and the governor's office, who would like to see this happen. So it might work. It might go that way. So I think the action, as I said, is going to be mostly right now, and it probably should be. I mean, there's some federal reforms, but I think the action should be at the state level.
Thanks so much, Kerry. And if you'd like to take a look at the study, it's at pacificresearch.org. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/PacificResearch1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.